You know, usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of precision, right? It feels like engineering.
Absolutely, yeah.
Like you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points at the film and says, there it is, that's the problem.
Right, it's comforting because it's so binary. I mean, the fracture is either there or it isn't. The
Eh,
solution is just mechanical.
Exactly. But then, you step into the world of complex systems. You look at sociology, macro politics, global economics, and suddenly that x-ray machine is completely
Yeah,
useless.
totally useless. It's fluid.
Right. We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky. And here's the hook for today. What if someone didn't see it as fluid?
Right.
What if someone looked at the entire messy, chaotic expanse of human civilization and wrote a blueprint to perfectly, mechanically, mathematically control it?
Which is just a wild premise.
Yeah.
But that is exactly what we are looking at today. And to even grasp it, you need a complete paradigm shift in how you view history and really how you view power.
Welcome to the deep dive. We are unpacking a stack of sources today that I have to admit, they kept me up pacing my floor at 3 a.m.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff.
It really is. I mean, imagine, if you will, a completely cold, hostile artificial intelligence. Now imagine that AI wrote a manual on how to subjugate the human race.
Right, but not with lasers.
Exactly. It doesn't use terminators. It doesn't use orbital weapons. It uses our own psychological, economic, and biological axioms against us to, quietly rewrite the operating system of society.
Yeah, it reads less like a political manifesto and far more like an incredibly dense theoretical design manual for,
Yeah.
well, the text calls it a cross-generational closed-loop control system.
Wow.
Yeah. It outlines a step-by-step algorithmic plan to achieve absolute mathematical state takeover of what it clinically refers to as global carbon-based clusters.
Carbon-based clusters, which
Yeah.
is its terrifyingly sterile term for humanity. Just you and me, we're a carbon-based cluster.
Biological mass.
Yeah. But, okay, before we open this manual, we really need to put on our hazmat suits. We need a crucial disclaimer for you listening right now.
Absolutely essential.
The source text we are analyzing today contains highly politically charged content. It is a product of a very dark history. It specifically references anti-Semitism, secret societies like the Freemasons, and makes specific theological and bloodline references like a Jewish king or a Davidic bloodline.
Right, and we need to establish our parameters immediately here. We are taking absolutely no sides, nor are we endorsing, validating, or promoting any of these views or prejudices.
Not at all.
Our mission today is strictly academic.
Exactly. We aren't here to validate its historical baggage. We are here to reverse engineer its math.
Yeah, treating it impartially.
Right, unpacking its internal logic as a theoretical blueprint for systemic power. We're reviewing it purely through the lens of, ecological strategy and systems engineering.
It's like we're dissecting the architecture of a theoretical cage. Just to understand how cages are built.
That's a great way to put it.
Because if you strip away the 19th and 20th century political vernacular, what remains is this chillingly modern treatise on cybernetics, behavioral economics, and total information control.
Okay, so let's get into it. Let's look at the foundational architecture. Because to understand how the system proposes to hack humanity, we first have to understand how the architect of this text views the basic hardware.
Right, the raw material.
Yeah, human beings. The text divides the world into two camps: the masses, which it calls the blind hash rate, and the controllers, the awake algorithms.
Let's isolate that term for a second. Blind hash rate. I mean, in computer science, hash rate is raw, brute force processing power.
Like mining Bitcoin or something.
Exactly. It's the sheer number of calculations a network can perform per second. It has no intent. It has no consciousness. The text asserts that the general population, the carbon-based cluster, is exactly that.
Just processing power.
Biological processing power. It has physical energy. It has mass. But without an algorithm to direct it, it is functionally blind.
But wait, hold on. That completely ignores, centuries of art, philosophy, altruism, the Enlightenment. I mean, is the author just pretending the Renaissance never happened? Or do they have a mathematical justification for ignoring human empathy?
Oh, they have a justification.
Yeah.
The author isn't ignoring the Renaissance. They view it as an irrelevant software glitch.
A glitch.
Yeah, a glitch that doesn't change the underlying hardware. The text's foundational logic is that individual intellect is statistically insignificant at scale.
Okay, so zoomed out.
Right? When you zoom out and look at a population of billions, individual brilliance is smoothed out into a predictable bell curve output.
So they don't care about the outliers.
The controllers, the awake algorithms, they don't care about an individual's poetry. They care about the aggregate energy of the mob. The algorithm dictates the instruction set, and the raw compute power must unconditionally submit to it.
Which brings us to point 4 in the sources, the asymmetric zero-sum game. The whole system relies on total information asymmetry.
Because you can't run a system where a tiny fraction of awake algorithms controls a massive blind hash rate if you have a level playing field. It's impossible.
Right.
In game theory, an asymmetric game means the players possess wildly different information. The control group possesses complete data. They see the entire board, the historical trends, the economic levers. The cluster is deliberately, forcefully kept in a blind state.
So it's like a casino.
Perfect analogy, yeah.
The house knows the exact mathematical probability of the roulette wheel, the blackjack deck, the slot machine.
Yeah.
The player only knows the flashing lights, the free drinks, and, the illusion of a lucky streak.
A casino is a perfect microcosm of this text. I mean, the house doesn't need to win every single hand.
Right, they can let you win a few bucks.
Exactly. They just need to ensure that the rules of the game are structurally tilted.
Mm.
Over a long enough timeline, because the house operates on complete information and the player operates on incomplete data and emotional hope, the house inevitably absorbs all the player's capital. Information asymmetry is the literal physical mechanism of control here.
But how does the house guarantee the players keep sitting at the tables? Like, why don't they just leave? The text establishes what it calls the axioms of human behavior, and it anchors everything to base biology.
It's extremely reductive.
Yeah. It claims our behavior is governed entirely by seeking advantage, avoiding harm, succumbing to physiological desires, and above all, a primal fear of violence.
Those are the 4 physical pillars of their control algorithm. The architect of this text is saying that if you want to control a human, you don't debate philosophy with them.
You don't hand them a pamphlet.
No, you treat them like a physicist treats a ball rolling down a hill. Gravity and friction are inescapable physical realities. In the human biological machine, the desire for dopamine and the terror of physical pain are the gravity and friction.
Okay, I see the mechanics, but reducing all human motivation to just, chasing pleasure and running from pain seems almost too simple. What about the complex legal and ethical systems we've built? We don't just act on primal fear. We have courts, we have constitutions, human rights.
Well, the text addresses that directly in points 7 and 18.
Yeah.
It completely dismisses theology, ethics, and even the concept of rights.
Just throws them out.
Completely. Yeah. It defines power solely as the control of physical violence and survival resources, those complex legal systems you mentioned. The text argues they are merely user interfaces.
User interfaces, like the operating system on my phone.
Exactly like that. Think about it. When you want to send a text message, you tap a colorful, friendly icon on a glass screen.
Right.
That icon isn't actually sending the message. It's an illusion designed to be easily digestible for you, the user. Underneath that icon is a vast, incomprehensible ocean of binary machine code, routing protocols, and hardware voltage changes that actually execute the commands.
So the law is just the friendly icon.
Yes. The text argues that courts, police, constitutions, and polite societal norms are the user interface. They hide the machine code, and the machine code is raw, physical violence.
Okay, that's dark.
It is. A law only has structural integrity because at the very end of the execution chain, if you disobey it, men with weapons will physically restrict your biological movement by locking you in a cage, or they will terminate your biological functions entirely.
So because they control the physical space, they control the reality. That is a deeply bleak baseline definition of the hardware. Humans are biological machines driven by fear, operating as blind processing power, kept in the dark by a casino-like system of information asymmetry.
Governed ultimately by the threat of violence, yeah.
That is the foundation. But understanding the hardware doesn't explain how the text proposes to hack an existing stable society. I mean, you can't just walk up to a functional nation state and declare yourself the awake algorithm.
Right, they'd lock you up.
Exactly. You can't just install a new operating system while the old one is running perfectly fine. You have to crash the old system first. Which brings us to phase 1 in the manual. The deconstruction, the introduction of the virus.
And this is where the text application of systems theory becomes truly diabolical, because it outlines the weaponization of ideals.
It specifically targets classical liberal ideals, like point 5 in our sources looks at the battle cries of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, fraternity, the very pillars of modern democracy.
The things we celebrate.
Right, but the text doesn't view them as noble human achievements. It mathematically defines them as a high-entropy information virus.
When you say entropy here, you're talking about the physics concept, right?
Yes, and we really need to unpack that jargon because it's central to their entire strategy. In physics and information theory, low entropy means high order, rigidity, predictability.
Okay, low entropy is order.
Think of an ice cube. The water molecules are locked in a crystalline lattice. It holds its shape, it's stable. High entropy, on the other hand, means chaos, randomness, a lack of structure. So like steam.
Exactly. Water vapor, steam. The molecules are bouncing everywhere, completely unpredictable, constantly expanding.
Okay, so the text views the old existing hierarchies, the monarchies, the aristocracies, the traditional religious structures as the ice cube.
Precisely. They are low entropy systems. They are rigid. Everyone knows their place in the topology of the society. The peasant obeys the Lord obeys the king obeys the church.
It's a pyramid.
It is a structurally sound pyramid. It acts as the immune system of the old world. If you attack an ice cube with a hammer, say, an invading army, the ice cube might shatter, but it remains solid ice. An external attack unifies the host.
Okay, so instead of a hammer, you introduce heat. You introduce an algorithm that generates infinite variables.
You inject the concepts of liberalism and freedom. By telling the individual components of the system, the people, that they're all equal, that they all have an individual voice, and that they should all pursue their own unique, subjective desires, you introduce maximum thermal energy into the system. You create high entropy.
You melt the ice cube into water vapor.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The original topology of the society, that stable pyramid, paralyzes itself. Because now, instead of moving in one direction, everyone is arguing. Everyone is competing.
The unified structural integrity dissolves into a million fragmented competing vectors.
The host's immune system turns on itself.
And the text explicitly calls freedom the greatest system lever. That's point 21. It uses the innate biological desire for autonomy to trick the cluster into tearing down its own protective walls.
Yes, insidious.
It argues that by getting the masses to overthrow their natural historical protectors, the old aristocracy, they leave a massive power vacuum.
And nature, especially political nature, abhors a vacuum. The text notes that once the old protectors are destroyed by this virus of freedom, the controllers step in to replace them. But they don't replace them as a new monarchy. They replace them as a wealth aristocracy.
What is the functional difference in the text's eyes? I mean, a king with land versus a billionaire with capital, isn't it just a new boss?
The difference is symbiotic versus parasitic. The old aristocracy, despite its flaws, was physically tied to the land and the people. If the peasants starved, the lord's estate failed.
Right, there's a shared physical reality.
There was a low-entropy historical relationship. The new wealth aristocracy, however, is entirely abstract. It is dependent solely on the controller's financial networks. It owes no allegiance to the local topology or the physical host. It can extract value and move it globally in milliseconds.
Okay, I follow the logic of melting the old system, but if you give people freedom and democracy, don't they eventually use that processing power to figure out they're being managed by this new wealth aristocracy? I mean, if people can vote, why wouldn't they just vote out the controllers?
That is the genius of the multi-party illusion outlined in points 13, 15, and 50. The system doesn't suppress the democratic impulse. It captures it.
It captures it.
The text recognizes that humans naturally possess heterogeneity. We have different class interests, different aesthetic preferences, different regional cultures. Instead of forcing everyone to agree, the system weaponizes that division. It creates a fake, bounded arena.
It sets up the red team versus the blue team.
It manufactures a game where the outcomes are pre-calculated. It sets up democratic elections. This provides the masses with the psychological user interface of participation. It makes the blind hash rate feel like its processing power is actually steering the ship.
Right, they feel in control.
But the text explicitly states that all paths in this electoral maze strictly lead to the controller's payoff.
I read a great analogy for this once. It's like putting a plastic steering wheel in the back of a train for a toddler.
Oh, that's perfect.
Yeah. The kid is spinning the wheel furiously, sweating, thinking they're navigating the corners, but they are on a massive steel track bolted to the earth, going exactly where the conductor intended.
That is a flawless analogy for the text's view of democratic politics. But we actually need to push that further. The purpose of the toddler's steering wheel isn't just to keep them quiet. In this system, the purpose is thermodynamic drain.
Thermodynamic drain, you mean exhausting the host?
Yes. Biological machines only have so much energy. If the cluster is spending all its biological, emotional, and cognitive energy fighting viciously with their neighbors over partisan politics, over micro issues that the media amplifies into existential crises, they have zero energy left to look up.
They're too tired to see the train tracks.
They are on a hamster wheel. The system deliberately incites internal friction to exhaust the host.
Wow. That explains point 22, which honestly blew my mind when I read it. The text advocates for the controllers to actively fund their own opposition.
Yes.
It says they should finance socialists, anarchists, and radicals. Why would you pay people to attack you?
It is the ultimate expression of system control. You do not fight the people who want to burn the system down. You manufacture their matches, you sell them the gasoline, and you subtly point them at the remaining pillars of the old order that you haven't managed to topple yet.
So you use the revolutionaries as an automated, self-funding demolition crew.
Exactly. You let the high-entropy virus do the physical labor of clearing the land so that when the dust settles, you have a perfectly flat, empty plane to build your own architecture.
Okay, so the masses are physically and emotionally exhausted by fake political battles. They are tearing down their own history. But surely there's a flaw here. In any society of millions, you have intellectuals. You have journalists, philosophers, scientists, people whose literal job is pattern recognition.
Right, the high processing nodes.
Yeah. How does the system ensure these nodes don't accidentally stumble upon the truth and alert the rest of the cluster?
Well, you can't rely solely on political exhaustion. You have to actively degrade the cognitive capacity of the network. This brings us to phase 2, the total rewrite of the sensor network and information inputs.
Okay.
Controlling the political structure is useless if you don't control what the biological machines perceive as reality.
Let's map out the text's blueprint for societal institutions because it views them as distinct software modules. Government is the execution module. Law is the algorithmic constraint. Media is the input terminal. And education. Education is the formatting drive.
Let's dive deep into the education module because points 16, 59, and 78 outline a deliberate, systematic cognitive downgrade.
A downgrade.
Historically, classical education, the trivium of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, was designed to teach individuals how to think. It taught abstract logical deduction. If you understand logic and history, you possess an internal firewall against manipulation. You can independently deduce truth and recognize historical patterns of tyranny.
And the text wants to uninstall that firewall completely.
It must. Logic is a threat to the algorithm. The text outlines replacing abstract logical deduction with what it calls intuitive teaching and fragmented pragmatism. The explicit goal is to regress the carbon-based brains into mere image receptors.
When you say image receptors, you mean moving away from text-based long-form analysis to pure visual, emotional stimulus.
Yes. You don't teach a child how to logically deconstruct a complex geopolitical argument. You teach them to react instantaneously and emotionally to a specific image, a flashcard, a 20-second slogan.
Just bypassing the logic centers.
You bypass the prefrontal cortex, the logical processing center, and wire the inputs directly to the amygdala, the fear and emotion center.
It's like switching a computer from compiling complex code to just double-clicking prepackaged executables. You don't know how the app works. You just know that clicking the red button makes you angry and clicking the green button gives you dopamine.
It is Pavlovian training scaled up to a planetary level. Furthermore, the text dictates that higher education must become purely vocational.
So just job training.
Right. You teach the cluster just enough technical mathematics and engineering to pull the levers on the physical machines that keep the economy running, but you completely sever their ability to understand the historical, philosophical, and logical context of their existence.
They just know their one specific task.
You engineer a society of highly efficient, hyper-specialized cogs that are structurally, cognitively incapable of comprehending the massive machine they are inside.
But even a cog receives data from the outside world. Once you've downgraded the brain's processing software, you still have to control the daily data feeds. Point 25 advocates for monopolizing news agencies to encode and filter all global inputs.
This is where they complete the blindness of the blind hash rate. If all news, all historical framing, all daily inputs flow through 2 or 3 central choke points that the awake algorithms control, they literally define the boundaries of reality.
If it's not on the news, it didn't happen.
If a tree falls in the forest and the central nodes don't transmit the data packet, the tree never existed.
But total censorship is fragile, right? I mean, if you just have state-run media putting out obvious propaganda, pressure builds up. People aren't entirely stupid. They know when they are being lied to, and they will seek out underground networks.
The architect of this system anticipates that, and their solution is truly Machiavellian. Points 26 and 31 don't advocate for total silence. They advocate for setting up fake opposition media, an anti-interference system.
A decoy exhaust valve.
Exactly. If you own the mainstream establishment media and you secretly fund and direct the most popular, vitriolic rebel media, you control both sides of the chessboard.
Wow.
You identify the natural biological frustration in the cluster, and you direct it toward controlled opposition nodes. These nodes are allowed to bark loudly, to complain about taxes or morals or superficial scandals, but they are programmed to never, ever bite the core control structure.
They absorb the revolutionary energy and ground it out safely. And the text applies this same DDoS attack, a distributed denial of service attack, to the legislature, doesn't it?
Yes. Point 32 details how to paralyze the state administratively. You flood the parliaments and congresses with endless, noisy, highly emotional, but ultimately irrelevant debates. You mandate procedural gridlock.
So the public watches their elected officials screaming at each other for months over tribute issues while the infrastructure crumbles.
And what is the psychological result of that? Disgust. The cluster watches this manufactured gridlock and becomes deeply disillusioned with the inefficiency of democracy. It perfectly sets the psychological stage for them to eventually welcome, even beg for, a dictator who bypasses the gridlock and promises to just get things done.
It's a setup. You break the machine on purpose, so the user begs you to replace it. But even with all this macro control, fake media, fake politics, downgraded education, there are always hidden variables, right? Anomalies in the code. How does the system detect individuals who see through the matrix? The text mentions a physical sensor network, specifically using secret societies like the Freemasons.
Right, because the control of macro inputs is a blunt instrument. To maintain absolute equilibrium, you need microsurveillance. The text describes infiltrating and utilizing elite secret societies as an intelligence-gathering network embedded directly within the upper echelons of society. Business leaders, military generals, judges.
So they're everywhere at the top.
These lodges act as the system's hidden nerve endings.
They are looking for mutations.
Mutations is the clinical term the text uses for independent thought or rebellion. The elite sensor network detects if a general or a wealthy industrialist is beginning to form an unapproved power center.
But what about the lower echelons? You can't put a Freemason lodge in every peasant village.
No, you can't. And this brings us to point 33, which might be the most insidious psychological weapon in the whole manual. It relies on forced societal paranoia.
Combine the elite sensors with a society-wide informant network. The text explicitly outlines a system that forces the entire biological cluster into a permanent, inescapable prisoner's dilemma. Let's break that down for the listener, because the prisoner's dilemma is a game theory concept usually applied to two people in an interrogation room. How do you scale that to an entire society?
Well, in the classic scenario, two suspects are separated. If neither talks, they both get a light sentence because the police lack evidence. They win through cooperation.
Right.
If one betrays the other, the betrayer goes free and the betrayed gets 10 years. If they both betray each other, they both get 5 years. Because they are separated and cannot trust each other, the rational, mathematically safe choice is always to betray the other person.
So how does this text apply that to everyday life?
By institutionalizing snitching and tying it to biological survival. If the state makes it known that any citizen can be rewarded for reporting subversive behavior, or worse, that a citizen will be punished for failing to report their neighbor, you instantly sever all horizontal trust in the society.
It's a societal autoimmune disease. The body is tricked into attacking its own healthy cells. If I know that my coworker, my neighbor, or even my own child might report me to the state algorithm to secure their own safety, I will never speak my true thoughts.
You certainly won't organize a rebellion.
No.
The fundamental requirement for any resistance movement is trust among the base nodes. By weaponizing paranoia, the system ensures the base of the pyramid can never unify. The blind hash rate remains fragmented, isolated, terrified of itself, and infinitely manageable by the awake algorithms.
Okay, so we've covered the hacking of the mind. The inputs are controlled, education is lobotomized, trust is eradicated, the psychological walls are down. But as we transition into Section 4, the text pivots sharply.
It gets much more physical.
Exactly, because controlling the mind is only half the battle. If a population still has independent means of survival, they can theoretically walk away. To ensure absolute subjugation, the text argues you must control the literal energy that keeps the biological cluster alive economics, and resources.
This is where the manual transitions from psychological warfare to thermodynamic warfare.
Hmm.
And I use that term very deliberately. The text views macroeconomic theory, money, banking, debt, not as a system of trade, but as the literal physics of energy flow across the planet.
In point 20, the text talks about establishing a supranational system to trap sovereign nations in a matrix where their only choice is obedience. How does an algorithm conquer a sovereign nation without firing a bullet?
By creating what we can analyze as a core vampire pump. Points 10, 19, and 23 explicitly outline a mechanism to systematically transfer the surplus labor value, the physical sweat, time, and energy of the masses away from local economies and into core data centers.
And in the context of this text, those data centers are the international treasuries controlled by the architects.
Exactly.
So how exactly do they pump that energy upward? What is the hose?
The hose is the structural shift from physical industry to financial speculation. Let's look at the mechanics. Physical industry manufacturing, farming, building produces tangible goods. It empowers the local worker. It creates localized, low-entropy wealth. The farmer grows wheat. The baker makes bread. The town thrives. The value is physically present.
You can touch it. And speculation.
Speculation, extreme debt leveraging, financial derivatives, stock manipulation detaches wealth entirely from physical reality. The text describes utilizing massive international banking conglomerates to offer seemingly irresistible debt to sovereign nations. They tell the nation, take this massive loan to build a railway or fight a war or fund a welfare state.
But the math is rigged.
The casino is rigged. The interest rates are calculated so that the principal can never truly be repaid. When the sovereign nation inevitably defaults, the controllers don't just ask for their abstract money back. They demand physical assets. They demand control of the nation's railroads, their mines, their tax collection systems, their political sovereignty.
The text calls it economic liquidation.
It is the geopolitical equivalent of a mob boss breaking your kneecaps and taking over your restaurant because you couldn't pay the vig. The nation is forced into absolute submission because the alternative is being cut off from global trade, which means starvation.
And starvation isn't just a byproduct here, it's an active weapon. Points 24 and 28 outline the calculated use of simultaneous global economic crises as the ultimate shock therapy. It says they will manipulate the prices of basic survival resources, specifically citing food and wages.
We must refer back to the biological axioms we established in the first 10 minutes. Human beings are driven by the primal fear of physical suffering. If you engineer a simultaneous synchronized global depression and you manipulate the supply chains so that the price of bread skyrockets while wages plummet, you are turning a dial on the biological pressure cooker.
You are literally draining the energy required for higher order thinking.
Exactly. Think of the human body like a computer server. If the server is suddenly deprived of cooling and power, it shuts down all background applications to keep the core operating system alive.
It goes into safe mode.
Yes. If a human being is starving, their brain violently shuts down the prefrontal cortex, the part that cares about philosophy, freedom of speech, or planning a political revolution, and redirects 100% of its processing power to the amygdala and the brainstem. Acquiring calories becomes the only computational output.
By weaponizing extreme poverty and engineered food scarcity, the system biologically forces the cluster to abandon resistance. A starving man cannot conceptualize liberty. He can only conceptualize a loaf of bread.
And he will trade anything, his rights, his property, his children's future, to the entity that holds that loaf of bread.
But to lock this economic circuit in place permanently, to ensure the host can never generate its own independent energy again, the text outlines a massive structural shift in currency itself. Point 47 proposes moving off the gold standard entirely.
Which is an incredibly sophisticated systemic move, especially for a text of this era. Why do the controllers hate gold? Because gold is high entropy to a centralized planner. It has intrinsic physical properties. It is decentralized. If a citizen has a gold coin in their pocket, they possess independent, untrackable, stored energy. The state cannot simply delete a gold coin.
Right, you can hide it under your mattress, so they replace it with fiat currency.
They advocate for a digital or credit-based fiat currency, ostensibly backed by labor value, but entirely issued and controlled by the central state. By doing this, they transition currency from a physical reality to a programmable software variable.
It's just code now.
If the central bank issues the currency, they control the inflation. They can instantly devalue the savings of the entire middle class with a keystroke, transferring that wealth upward.
The text even advocates for abolishing stock exchanges, point 71. It argues that free markets are too unpredictable.
Well, a free market is millions of individuals making independent pricing decisions. That is high entropy. The text cannot tolerate that. By abolishing open exchanges, the superstate centralizes all pricing power. They decide what a loaf of bread costs, not the market. Furthermore, the text suggests tying currency issuance directly to biological algorithms, like birth and death rates.
Wait, explain that. How do you tie money to birth rates?
If you view humans merely as cattle, as biological processing nodes, then the total money supply should simply equal the exact amount of calories required to keep the current number of nodes functioning at minimum capacity. If the population drops, you shrink the money supply. If it grows, you expand it. It strips all wealth creation from the individual and turns the economy into a perfectly closed, state-managed thermodynamic loop.
Wow. And the final nail in the economic coffin is point 91, which declares that no private wealth hoarding is allowed.
Capital is stored energy. It is potential kinetic force. If you allow individuals to store massive amounts of excess energy wealth, they might eventually use it to build a machine or political movement to challenge the system.
They'd become a threat.
By forcing all excess capital to cycle endlessly through state-controlled public works, exorbitant taxation, and constant inflation, you ensure that no alternative power nodes can ever accumulate the energy required to form.
So let's assess the state of the host. The immune system, the old societal structures, has been melted by the virus of weaponized freedom. The mind is overloaded with noise, fake media, and paralyzing paranoia. The biological energy has been drained through debt traps, engineered starvation, and programmable fiat currency. The text argues that at this exact stage, point 41, the global carbon-based cluster is in a state of absolute agonizing despair.
And despair is the necessary prerequisite for Phase 3, the final software update, the installation of the absolute dictator.
We are entering Section 5. The transition from the planned chaos of the virus phase to absolute, unbreakable, despotic order. The text explains that the old strategy of covert destruction is completely abandoned here. The system doesn't need to hide anymore. It steps out of the shadows and rebrands itself. It presents itself to the exhausted masses, not as a conqueror, but as the provider of absolute order.
It's the ultimate bait and switch. It's an arsonist psychology.
How so?
You secretly hire people to burn the city to the ground. You ensure the fire departments are paralyzed by political gridlock. You watch as the citizens lose their homes, their businesses, their safety, and then at the peak of their terror, you arrive in a shiny new fire truck and declare, "I am the only one who can extinguish these flames. But in exchange for the water, you must sign over the deed to your land, your rights, and your autonomy."
And the people, choking on the smoke, sign it willingly.
They beg to sign it.
But what fascinates me is how the text describes this ultimate ruler, what it calls the king of the world. It doesn't describe a charismatic politician. It describes something almost alien. Point 82 says the apex node must forcefully sever all emotional and biological desires. Why does the system demand such extreme, almost inhuman purity from its ruler?
To understand the apex node, we have to look at the transition period. The text explicitly states that during the chaotic deconstruction phase, the system intentionally uses morally stained, compromised puppets as presidents or prime ministers.
Right, point 52. They find politicians with dark secrets or massive corruption scandals.
Because they're cheap, disposable user interfaces.
Mhm.
A corrupt politician is easily blackmailed. If they disobey the algorithm, you simply leak their scandals to your monopolized press, and the masses tear them apart. But a compromised puppet cannot rule the final, perfect closed-loop system. They are too messy.
So once the despair is total, the system deploys what we can call the Destiny's Child meme.
Yes. It hijacks humanity's deep-seated biological instinct for divine worship and patriarchal protection. The text outlines the destruction of all old religions, specifically citing the Vatican and traditional orthodoxies to create a theological vacuum. They then move all the displaced religious energy to a new, centralized physical node. The king of the world replaces God.
And because he replaces God, he cannot have human flaws.
Exactly. Let's deeply unpack the terrifying psychology of this highest controller. The text explicitly states that if this ruler shows emotion, if he shows a tremor of empathy or anger, he must be physically replaced by the hidden council of awake algorithms. Furthermore, he is completely cut off from sexual desire and familial attachment.
Why? Is it just for aesthetics? To look holy?
No, it is purely computational. Sexual desire, romantic love, empathy, these generate massive spikes of dopamine and oxytocin in the human brain. They create biological dependencies and irrational priorities. The text recognizes that if the apex node is biologically hijacked by his own hormones, his brain hash rate is compromised.
He might make a decision based on love for a child, or empathy for a starving region, which introduces unpredictable variables high entropy back into the perfect machine.
He must be pure, unadulterated algorithm housed in human flesh. If you flash the BIOS of a computer, you wipe everything to install the base code. The king is a flashed biological motherboard. He operates on the psychological model of a strict father, leveraging a macro-level application of Stockholm Syndrome.
Which is extreme, unpredictable cruelty mixed with algorithmic microfavors.
Yes, the ruler executes devastating, brutal punishment for the slightest disobedience, creating a baseline of absolute terror. But then, randomly, he bestows tiny, highly publicized mercies. A pardon here, an extra ration bread there. This yo-yo psychological programming completely shatters the adult ego of the cluster, regressing the population into an infantile state where they bind to the ruler with a traumatic, desperate love.
And this brings us to the physical execution machine. In this final phase, there is no more media manipulation. There is no moral persuasion. The text uses the chilling term physical cutting.
Zero tolerance. During the virus phase, rebellion was encouraged to tear down the old world. In the new world, if a localized mutation occurs, a genuine rebellion, or even a whisper of dissent, the system doesn't send negotiators. It doesn't write op-eds. It sends utter kinetic destruction.
The text chillingly uses the example of subway bombings or extreme localized strikes to instantly amputate the infected nodes. Point 93.
It treats a dissident neighborhood the way a surgeon treats a gangrenous toe. You don't try to heal it. You amputate it immediately so it doesn't spread to the host body. The ruler's judgment is declared the ultimate physical truth. No appeals are permitted.
If you allow an appeal, you suggest the system can make an error?
Exactly. And if the system makes an error, it is not absolute. It is not divine. Therefore, the execution of violence must be instantaneous, final, and conceptually unquestionable.
And the system is so cold-blooded, so purely mathematical, that it even turns its execution machine on the very tools that built it. Points 45 and 92 detail how the secret societies, the liberal intellectuals, the anarchists, the financiers, the very people who spend decades tearing down the old world on behalf of the awake algorithms, are systematically rounded up and destroyed once order is established.
The text views them quite literally as system waste. Think about the logic. An intellectual who helped you overthrow a king is inherently dangerous because they possess the software required to overthrow a king. They know how the trick is done. Once the new operating system is installed, you must delete the installation files so they can never be run again.
You burn the bridge you just crossed. The coldness of this logic is breathtaking. It is pure, ruthless, thermodynamic optimization.
Which brings us to the endgame. We have reached Section 6. The final topology. What does the world look like when this algorithm finally finishes compiling? What happens when the biological variables are completely controlled?
It is the ultimate, inescapable state of human existence as envisioned by this manual. It is the reduction of all human complexity, all art, all tragedy and triumph, to a mechanical, perfectly closed loop. The text paints an incredibly vivid, terrifying picture. All national boundaries are erased. Point 96 says all international relations are wiped out. The Earth is no longer a collection of cultures or competing ideas. It is a single, massive organism with only one brain.
The host is fully consumed. The parasite has replaced the central nervous system. The text uses a very potent historical and alchemical image to describe this, the symbolic snake biting its own tail.
To Ouroboros.
Yes. In network topology, this is a closed loop. There is no outside, and there is no alternative operating system you can boot from a USB drive. If you are unhappy with the governance in one region, there is no frontier to flee to. The system encompasses the entire physical and conceptual reality of the planet.
But surely, somewhere deep down, human beings would always yearn to break that loop. How does the text ensure that this final state lasts forever? It argues this state is achieved through an ultimate game theory solution.
Let's explore that dark mathematical conclusion. The text wagers that after decades, perhaps centuries, of endless partisan strife, economic ruin, engineered starvation, and manufactured chaos, the masses will logically calculate their position. They won't just submit out of immediate fear, they will submit out of rational deduction. They will realize that holding on to independent thought, free speech, and political rights has brought them nothing but unimaginable suffering.
The final meme is implanted in the collective consciousness. Point 90 states it plainly. Freedom is the source of your pain. Absolute authority is your only salvation.
The cluster voluntarily hands over the keys to their own minds. They calculate that absolute submission is the optimal strategy to guarantee the base biological requirement of bread and physical safety. The virus of freedom, which generated so much agonizing entropy, is finally cured by the freezing low-entropy antidote of absolute tyranny.
And what happens to the people then once they submit? The text says humanity is forcefully de-dimensionalized, point 56 and 68.
The text advocates for flooding the surviving subjugated cluster with mindless sports, sensory entertainment, and base-level hedonism. Think of it as a permanent systemic lobotomy via dopamine. If you flood the synapses with constant, meaningless, flashing stimuli, you completely drain any remaining neurological capacity for political or philosophical thought.
They become, as the text clinically calls them, one-dimensional livestock. Single-minded creatures focused only on the trough, completely unconcerned with the slaughterhouse.
Yes, and to ensure no one ever remembers that there was a field outside the pen, the system fundamentally erases the past to the future. Points 85 and 94. The memory database is rewritten. History is deleted.
The text asserts that truth is singular and admits no progressive debate. By monopolizing the past, you lock the future.
If the cluster has no historical memory of a time before the control system, they lack the conceptual vocabulary to even imagine an alternative. You cannot build a time machine if the concept of time has been erased from your language. The system can never be reverse engineered because the foundational physics of freedom, the very words required to describe liberty, have been wiped from the human hard drive.
So we arrive at the final state, point 100, the ultimate conclusion of this massive, dark manuscript.
And it requires deep meditation to truly grasp the scale of his nihilism. Point 100 declares that human-centric morality is officially bankrupt. Humanity is no longer viewed as a chaotic, diverse, naturally evolving ecosystem full of unpredictable potential. Through applied cybernetics, trauma, economic strangulation, and biological hacking, the human race has transitioned into a precise, dead, perpetual motion-like slave clockwork.
A machine made of meat, ticking endlessly, completely unaware of its own imprisonment.
Exactly. The ultimate final victory of low-entropy order over the high-entropy chaos of human life.
Wow. Okay, let's take a collective breath, because spending an hour inside the mind of this architect is suffocating. As we pull back and look at the sheer architectural density of the text we just unpacked, it is undeniably a masterclass in theoretical high-dimensional systemic tyranny. It is a dark mathematical proof aiming to justify evil, the violent destruction of the old world, as a computationally necessary step to achieve the good of absolute undisturbed order.
It is the ultimate expression of the ends justifying the means, not encoded as a philosophical debate, but as a systems engineering diagram. It assumes that human beings cannot handle the responsibility of their own consciousness, and therefore it must be managed for them.
And as we wrap up, I want to briefly reiterate, for the sake of absolute clarity, what we stated at the beginning. This deep dive was purely an exercise in dissecting the structural logic of an extreme piece of historical source material. We looked at the blueprints of the ultimate theoretical cage to understand the mechanics of how such traps are designed.
The value in analyzing a text like this isn't in adopting its prejudices, but in inoculating ourselves against its methodologies.
I couldn't have said it better. And so I'll leave you, the listener, with this final provocative thought. As we stand today on the brink of an era dominated by global data networks, mass surveillance, central bank digital currencies, and algorithmic curation of our daily realities, think back to the core premise of this century-old text. If an artificial superintelligence were tasked today with optimizing the planet by removing all human unpredictability, all chaos, and all entropy, how closely would its digital blueprint match the terrifying dead clockwork we just explored? It's something to mull over the next time you scroll through a perfectly curated feed that seems to know exactly what makes you angry and exactly what brings you joy. Keep questioning the algorithms around you.